Welcome to the Week in 60 Minutes from Spectator TV, recorded on Thursday, November the 19th. On this week's show, we'll look at the continuing fallout since Dominic Cummings was booted out of 10 Downing Street last week, Boris Johnson's efforts to reboot his government with yet another Green New Deal, and the latest from the Brexit negotiations, which really do seem to be entering the endgame at last. We'll be joined by Katie Bowles, the Spectator's deputy political editor. She's written this week's cover story on the Prime Minister. Robert Peston, ITV's political editor, the Spectator's political editor, James Forsyth, and Wolfgang Munchau, recently of the FT, now director of Eurointelligence. Before we go, we'll also take a quick look at Mr. Trump's election lawsuits with our US editor, Freddie Gray, and with Candace Owens, the radical conservative commentator, formerly at the campaign group Turning Point, and the author of Blackout. Now, if you're watching on YouTube, subscribe to our channel. Just tap the red subscribe button below this video, followed by the bell icon, which appears afterwards. This way, you'll never miss an episode. As always, a special thanks to Charles Stanley for supporting this episode of The Week in 60 Minutes. Charles Stanley is one of the UK's leading wealth management firms, one of the oldest companies on the London Stock Exchange. We start with the Johnson administration's efforts to relaunch itself in the wake of the civil war inside Downing Street. Now, we know who the casualties were, but what's the direction now for the government? And does Boris Johnson have the stamina or the wit to head out to pastures new? This week's Spectator cover story is Boris in a Spin. It's by Katie Bowles. She joins me now, as does Robert Peston and James Forsyth. So, Katie, yet another Green New Deal, more for defense, less perhaps for international aid. Is this the start of a major reboot for Mr. Johnson?
Well, it depends who you ask, and I think what's really striking about this reset, and we've been told by some senior figures in government this is Boris Johnson's reset week, no one seems to be able to agree on how big a change this is, on if there is a new policy direction, if it's still very much what it was before. And I think it points to the fact there is a vacuum in government right now. We know Dominic Cummings and Lee Cain have gone. We know that there are some figures in the ascendancy, including Allegra Stratton, the Prime Minister's new spokesperson, who's now taking the lobby briefings, but yet we're still trying to find out who the key players are going to be. What's really struck me this week is if you walk around Westminster, everyone seems to have a spring in their step. Tory MPs will wax lyrical about what a new dawn this is, a happier era for Boris Johnson. Cabinet ministers are, cock-a-hoo, to be honest, and that's in large because they think they're getting their power back, we're returning to a cabinet government. But yet, when you delve a little bit deeper, all these factions seem to think that this is going to be a new era in which the Prime Minister listens to them a lot more. You had the One Nation group this week have a meeting on Zoom where they talked about how they could use this opportunity to move the Prime Minister to the centre. You also have a Northern Research Group talking about how it's going to mean more money for the North. Libertarian MPs even think this is good news for ending lockdown. I'm not convinced they're all going to be satisfied once we get Boris Johnson having to make decisions.
I'm pretty convinced they're not all going to be satisfied. That's the way politics is. What do you make of it, Robert? You sometimes wonder whether all these policy announcements that come out, especially this stuff on the Green New Deal, not much of which is actually that new, is not being pushed so much because they believe in all these things in 10 Downing Street, but that Mr. Johnson is desperately trying to find new ways of defining himself and moving things on.
Look, it's been a grim period for all of us. It's been a grim period for him, a country defined by the COVID-19 crisis, and that is going to continue. He's desperately trying to offer us proof that he's got, other sort of tricks up his sleeve, a plan to regenerate. I was very struck by what Katie said about, a spring in ministers and officials' step. Look, I have to say, I think this is a sort of false dawn. You will be acutely aware, Andrew, about the economic and fiscal and indebtedness cost of all of this. Next week, we will see the projections from the Office of Budget Responsibility of quite how much debt we've accumulated so far and how much more debt the country is likely to, or the government is likely to have to take on as this economic malaise, which is associated with this virus, continues. I think that's going to be a very big and very shocking moment for the Tory party and for the country. And I think the realization that this indebtedness will be defining the politics of the next 5 years will, in a sense, make everything else that's been happening over the last few days in terms of the soap opera of Downing Street feel pretty insignificant. And I also think one other point's worth making about Dominic Cummings. Yes, it's true that personal relations within Downing Street had become toxic. And I think many people would say that both Dominic Cummings and Lee Kane didn't handle their personal relations within government optimally. But if you talk to senior people at the centre of government, including senior civil servants, they say one thing about Dominic Cummings, which is that he had big ideas and he was an energizer of groups of people within government for change. And the Prime Minister will miss that. There is nobody in Downing Street creating a big agenda for him now that Cummings has gone. People focus on the need for a chief of staff. And of course, Downing Street needs to be better organised. But Prime Ministers also need people with big ideas. And Boris Johnson is, frankly, for all his, for all the strengths that his colleagues thinks he have, he's not somebody who is associated with an ideology and with ideas. So he will need to find somebody to replace Cummings, and pretty fast, I think.
James, I was rereading, because that's the kind of person I am, Gordon Brown's New Deal of 2009. He promised 400,000 new jobs. He promised all sorts of more wind turbines and a new green economy, indeed a recovery on the back of green investment. So here's your starter for 10 today, James. What's the difference now between Boris Johnson and Gordon Brown?
I think one of the big differences is that how the technology has developed. I think 10 years ago, shifting to more green energy was going to be very expensive for households. I think now, the price of offshore wind has fallen quite dramatically. And so I think that is a difference. I think there is an interesting question, which is, as one minister put it to me a few months back, there's no doubt that on this stuff, Boris Johnson is a green Keynesian. He thinks that, you've got to get demand going again, so you might as well spend it on green stuff. And I think a lot of Tories view the net zero by 2050 target as, yes, it's something that's signed up to in law, but it's not something that keeps them up at night. I think that Boris Johnson does take it a bit more seriously than that. I think there is an interesting question here, which is, as Robert said, is the government going to end up suffering from kind of political long COVID as the public finances are left in such a poor state at the end of this crisis? Or are we going to see, with the vaccine and the like, that the economic rebound is perhaps slightly sharper than expected? And that would enable Boris Johnson to play the role that he is much more naturally suited to than he has been to dealing with this pandemic, which is, being the boosterish figure, trying to get the animal spirits and confidence moving.
Robert, you mentioned the deficit figures we're going to get next year. They're going to be eye-watering amounts of money we'll be borrowing, and huge additions to the national debt, huge increase to the deficit, the budget deficit this year and next, and probably as far as the eye can see. The politics of this are interesting, though, because it looks like the British Tories are a bit like the American Republicans, that they're not deficit hawks when it's their guy in power. And I think you'll see now, Trump was the opposite of he was full of fiscal incontinence. And the Republicans pretty much kept their powder dry. They didn't complain too much. Now, of course, it's not their guy that's going to be in the White House. They'll rediscover their fiscal hawk credentials. So it looks like the Tories, as long as they're in power, they will not be the fiscal hawks they've been.
Look, I'm sure that's right. I mean, let's be clear. Boris Johnson looks sort of almost nauseous when he is forced to address the austerity question. He does not want to return to austerity. And as James says, whether he would define himself quite as explicitly as a Keynesian as James has said. He undoubtedly is a Keynesian.
In reality, in practice,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not sure
Yeah.
he would know what a Keynesian is in terms of an economic concept, but in practice, that's what he's become. Mind you, maybe we're all Keynesians now, I think, as somebody once said, Robert.
Well, look, it's very, hard if you just look at the politics of this country to argue that it's, a great idea politically to go back to austerity. But I think there's there's a much bigger point here, which you'll be aware of. And it is this. Across the West, we are seeing the most dramatic rise in indebtedness in our lifetimes, far greater than we saw even after the banking crisis of 2007 to 2008. And what that represents, since we are seeing an economic recovery in Asia, is the fastest transfer of economic power, relatively speaking, from the West to China and other Asian countries. And economic power, as we know, translates into political power too. And I don't think really that any of the West has really woken up to the long-term significance of the relative mismanagement of COVID in the West compared to Asia, and what that means in a very profound sense for the balance of power. The only good thing to say about the UK is that pretty much the whole of the West is in this together. It is not just a UK problem, although you could argue that our finances are deteriorating a bit worse than elsewhere, but everywhere we are seeing this problem. And the one thing that does, I think, alarm me, though, is even though it's a collective problem for the West, the point that you just made about the Republicans, and I think we can now translate that into the view of the Democrats too, as they take power in the White House, is that America constantly takes comfort from the fact that it is still the world's most powerful economy, and it has the reserve currency. The rules that apply to us, the worries that apply to, for example, Europe about indebtedness simply don't apply to the US yet, because international investors have to own US debt. They don't, however, have to own European debt. And I fear that there are all sorts of very difficult questions that governments across the West are going to have to ask over the next year. And I don't even think they've begun to ask themselves these questions. These are epoch-changing times.
Indeed, they are. Katie, coming back to the relaunch or attempted relaunch of Mr. Johnson's government, in terms of policy, any idea what else we can expect?
Well, I think what's interesting was last week you had a few briefings going out about the idea that Boris Johnson, his reset was going to involve a less dogmatic approach on Scotland, a push on women's issues, and also the environment. Now, we have the 10-point plan, but I do think it's worth bearing in mind that a lot of that was in the works before, Dominic Cummings and Lee Cain left. There was a debate about the timing of this announcement. Some don't think it's a great idea to do this in the middle of a pandemic or a lockdown. But in terms of the other areas, I think we're just in such a state of flux. And what's quite interesting is this, when you speak to senior figures in government now about what they want to do, I think Number 10 were taken aback by the idea that they were going to have this big pivot. So Boris Johnson has spent a lot of this week, and he is in self-isolation this week, it's worth pointing out, after the Test and Trace app pinged him, speaking to Tory MPs and trying to reassure them that he's still committed to the Level Up agenda. But I think what you keep hearing is let Boris be Boris. I've lost count of the number of times I've heard cabinet ministers say that, Tory MPs say that, his senior advisors say that. But the question we then come back to, and why I think it's all quite murky, is, well, what is Boris Johnson's agenda? Because we hear what Carrie Simmonds' agenda is. We've heard a lot about what Dominic Cummings' agenda is. And that's why, for all the positivity right now in Westminster from Tory MPs about where this is going, about being listened to more, the more senior figures of government you speak to, I think the more scepticism there is. And I have had several senior members of government say to me this week, the problem here is you can change all the staff in the world. If you still have a prime minister who can't make a decision and stick to it, it's not going to make a little bit of difference. And also heard him compared to a weather vane, somebody who constantly changes his mind. And that's why, although we're getting a sense in terms of the defence spending, even things such as you mentioned in your introduction, international aid could be cut for a year. We know that's something the Chancellor wants as a way of trying to, pay for lots of things that he's being asked to pay for while trying to, stop debt spiralling further. Now, there's a very big effort right now in government to make Boris Johnson not do this. There are Tory MPs, ministers lobbying for him to not reduce international aid. And there's this sense that he will say one thing to one group, listen to another and change his mind. So even that isn't definite. And I think that means that when we're talking about what this reset really is, it goes back to Robert's point, which is we have had, figures leave government who had strong visions, and those who spend a lot of time with Boris Johnson are not sure what his vision is, other than a few things we've heard this week.
No, I have no idea. When people say let Boris be Boris, I have no idea what they're talking about. When people said let Reagan be Reagan or let Thatcher be Thatcher, I knew exactly what they were talking about. I have no idea what it means in Mr. Johnson's case. But let's come to the question, Katie. I want to speak to James in a minute as well again, then come back to Robert. But let's come to the question, the big question that everybody wants to know the answer to. What's the truth about Carrie Symonds' role in 10 Downing Street?
Look, I think she is clearly a very influential figure. I think that we've clearly got to a point now where that person is being written about on a daily basis. There's a profile of Carrie Symonds in this week's Spectator too, but also just in the newspapers. I think we've moved from a point where a couple of weeks ago, she didn't get so much attention in terms of her views, what she's doing behind the scenes, to the fact that in a way she's getting as much airtime in terms of her views as Boris Johnson. What I've been really struck by is one of the things that MPs and ministers expect, and I think even those in Downing Street say is going to happen, is a cabinet reshuffle. Timing, not so sure. I think there's a sense that you might want your chief of staff in place first, but it's not being completely ruled out this side of Christmas. And I think when you start talking to people saying, oh, who's going to be up and down in the reshuffle, I'm struck by the number of Tory politicians who will just really go in by saying, well, I think it could be this person because Carrie Symonds worked with them. It could be this person because Carrie Symonds, favours them. And I think that shows that in terms of a political broker, she is judged within the Tory party as someone with immense influence.
Well, Robert, listening to Kate there, it sounds that in a very different way, but still in terms of influence, at least for the moment, while there's something of a vacuum in 10 Downing Street, Carrie Symonds is the new Dominic Cummings.
I'm not sure that's quite.
Discuss.
No, I don't think she's the new Dominic Cummings. I think she's just an influential player, like a number of influential players. What we're looking for is who's going to be a chief of staff. I mean, one of the things that I think many thought was weird about Johnson's approach to government was he had a very senior aide, the most influential aide, Dominic Cummings, who was very powerful when it came to ideas, refused to be chief of staff, but was sort of a block on a proper chief of staff being appointed because he didn't want somebody on top of him. It's slightly odd that the Prime Minister thought that was a sort of sensible organisational relationship. He does need a chief of staff, but like all really successful Prime Ministers, particularly in a time of crisis, he does need a person or people with big ideas and with the ability to grasp the magnitude of problems. Now, let's be clear, Munira Mirza has been, in a slightly quieter way, quite an influential figure. She will continue to be an influential figure. It's not obvious to me that she has that sort of breadth of economic vision and sort of breadth of geopolitical ideas that Cummings had. Given that Johnson himself is enthused by ideas but doesn't seem to come up with, he's not like Thatcher. He doesn't have a sort of coherent vision of how to remake Britain. And he's probably not really like Blair either, in the sense that Blair took the lessons of Thatcher and remade Labour for a generation as an electable party. As you said, we just don't know what Boris Johnson really stands for. And I think at a time of such crisis, and we've talked about the big challenges he faces, that is a problem. I suppose the one, and I think he also has one sort of personality trait that I'm not sure is quite right for these times. Historically, he's been very successful because he's such an optimist. But I fear that in the last few months, he's rather let himself down and possibly let the country down by finding it impossible not to finish whatever statement he's making about these awful times on a sort of, well, it's all going to be all right because testing is going to sort us out within a matter of weeks, or a vaccine is going to sort us out within a matter of weeks. I mean, picking up on what James has just said, there is absolutely no doubt that the most important and positive thing we've seen in the last couple of weeks is a couple of vaccines that show extraordinary efficacy. I mean, more than 90% efficacy is much better than anybody thought as quickly as this, and that is tremendously good news. And there are lots of signs coming out of the AstraZeneca Oxford trials that that's going to be a good vaccine. But we should be under no illusion that logistically it will be impossible to vaccinate enough people to give us, notorious phrase, herd immunity till late spring, early summer. It's just going to be impossible. And that means we are going to be living with some kind of restrictions, and we're going to be living with, at best, sluggish economic growth for months and months and months. And I'm not sure the Prime Minister has quite done the right kind of job, which is it's a sort of wartime spirit job of basically conditioning the British people to recognise it ain't going to get spectacularly better for quite some time. I'm afraid we've got years of living with the legacy of all of this. I don't want to sound pessimistic, or too pessimistic. We will get through it, but we'll only get through it if we're realistic about the costs.
Well, Robert, since I've got you here, then let's pick up on that, and then I'll finish off with Katie and James. If you think growth next year is going to be sluggish, it may well be, and it could be sluggish in 2023. I mean, I wouldn't entirely discount that very suddenly we'll be in the roaring 20s. This time the 2020s, not the 1920s. Because if we were sitting here in 1920, none of us would have predicted the roaring 20s of that decade in America. So, but I take your point that, there could be sluggish growth for the next year or two. If that's the case, and given all these huge spending demands that now rain down on the Treasury, from the Green New Deal to defense spending to the Northern infrastructure investment, what are the constraints? What are the rules that now govern how much the government can borrow?
I mean, this is a bit of a nightmare question. I mean, well, in the sense that we're getting, we've got an announcement as we speak from the Prime Minister saying that defence spending will rise something like 10% a year, right? Obviously, armed forces thrilled, lots of Tory MPs in particular thrilled. But the impression has been created that once we're probably going to add something like £400 billion to the national debt, £400 billion to the national debt this fiscal year to the end of March. I mean, these are outside of a war, these are unprecedented increases in the national debt. And the impression one has got at the moment is that the government has sort of decided, well, in the context that debt's rising by that much anyway, what's another 5, 10, 15, 20 billion pounds on top of that? In other words, we seem to have entered a period where the psychology of the government is everything is affordable, because by the old rules, everything that's happening at the moment is completely unaffordable. And since we're still alive, we might as well just borrow and borrow and borrow and do all the things that we haven't done over the last 10 years. And, that's plainly not sustainable for the long term. It's sustainable for a few months to cheer people up. It's sustainable for a bit to get the animal spirits going again. So maybe the private sector is a bit more confident and we get a revival of the economy because, you know, there is a bit more demand there and, you know, a bit more spending there. And, you know, and just to be clear, I don't rule out that towards the end of the year, there's, you know, a significant economic bounce. You know, the vaccine is a huge breakthrough. Activity will return. The issue is not whether activity returns. It's, you know, I mean, if we are back to the roaring 20s, then heaven help us, because we all know what that kind of economic bubble, and it was a bubble, led to. It led to the Great Crash and the decade of the Depression. And, you know, one of the things I worry about, and, you know, is that this recovery we're getting into is, you know, if we get a roaring 20s scenario of that kind of asset price inflation, it will prick at some point, and if we're very unlucky, it'll burst in a way that then leaves us with years and years of misery. And what worries me, and genuinely worries me, is there is no sign of any, you know, leading Western government thinking about what this level of indebtedness, you know, rising actually means. And, you know, I don't take comfort from the rise in the stock market. It looks like a bubble to me. And it just shows, again, how short-termist everybody is being. I know I'm slightly renowned for being gloomy about these things. What I would say is we really got to have an honest debate about all of this. And you know, I applaud the Prime Minister for, you know, essentially encouraging us to believe that, you know, there will be significant life after this. That's true, but we've got to have an honest debate about the costs.
James, who now speaks for the Northern Blue Wall?
I think that is a very good question, Andrew. I think you saw that Boris Johnson's desire to see the Northern Research Group of Tory MPs. You know, he said to them, look, you know, you've got to kind of keep me honest on the North, on this levelling up agenda. I think you will see more of that. I think it's worth remembering that the Chancellor is a Yorkshire MP, and I think this is the big question. You know, they've got to. If the Tories have the 2019 election bequeathed the Tories an odd electoral coalition, but they won Bolsover, Grimsby, and Redcar. But they also held cities of London and Westminster, Cheltenham and Winchester. So what they've got to do is they've got to find a way to keep that coalition together for 2024. And I think that, you know, the prerequisite of holding those blue wall seats is to deliver on levelling up. And what does that mean? I mean, that has to mean better broadband, better transport and better high streets. I think those are the kind of tangible things in people's lives that they are going to look to see. And if the Tory government cannot deliver that by the time of the next election, voters aren't going to thank them for getting Brexit done. They will just simply, I think, revert back, either not vote or revert back to their old traditional tribal allegiances to Labour. I think the Tories have a small window to deliver improvements in these voters' lives before all these voters kind of give up on the experiment.
But what evidence we have, given the government's record on COVID and the billions that have been spent on test and trace and on PPE, a lot of it ending up in the pockets of their cronies or relatives or friends. What evidence do we have that the Johnson administration has the ability to deliver when it talks about a massive increase in wind farms and moving to electric cars by 2030, even now talking about getting rid of every gas heater in every home in the country? What evidence is it that they're capable of doing any of that correctly?
Look, I think you are right that, as Robert said, you know, in terms of handling this crisis, the East Asian democracies have done a much better job than the Western ones. And you've seen how far the West has fallen behind in terms of public administration. I think the big question, really, the big political question is, what happens with this Oxford vaccine and if it works, and how quickly can it be rolled out? I think that I think it because so far as you say rightly, Andrew, the British state has not distinguished itself in its handling of this crisis, and nor has the Johnson government. But if you got to a stage where there was a British vaccine that the UK had a large number of doses of, and it successfully managed to immunise a large percentage of the population rapidly, and was able to move from that to reopening the economy and getting things going again, I think that would make people think that the government had more of a grip and was more competent. And I think so I think the importance of this vaccine, which is the thing that breaks this cycle of lockdowns, which was absolutely killing the Johnson government, that is, I think, the crucial political question. Does this Oxford vaccine work when we get its results in the next week or two? And how quickly can the government manage to roll it out?
Katie, final question to you on this segment of the show. Whatever troubles Mr. Johnson faces, and there are many, and he's still got a lot of big decisions to take. A Green New Deal doesn't solve all his problems by any means, but he does have an ally, doesn't he? The Labour Party seems to be doing its best to help the Tories.
Yes, just as everyone wants to talk about blue on blue, we had Labour infighting resurface this week regarding Jeremy Corbyn and his suspension from the Labour Party over the EHRC report into anti-Semitism in the party. Now, Jeremy Corbyn was suspended after he said in a statement a while ago that the problem was overstated, but then a committee, the NEC, decided that he would be reinstated to the party. This quickly led to a big row because people pointed out that Keir Starmer had alleged he was going to take strong actions only to let Jeremy Corbyn back in. And it seemed as though Keir Starmer was going to succeed in annoying every single group, both the Jewish community and supporters of Jeremy Corbyn who were annoyed he was suspended in the first place. After, I think, sleeping on it overnight, Keir Starmer chose to withdraw the whip from Jeremy Corbyn. So you now have a situation where I think one way to imagine it is Jeremy Corbyn is a Labour member and could go to Labour Party conference, but he's not a Labour MP, he's an independent MP. And I think it has once again lifted the lid on infighting in the party and the fact that there is not a huge number, but definitely a significant portion of current Labour MPs who are loyal to Jeremy Corbyn over Keir Starmer. And is that going to be difficult for the Labour leader going forward? It definitely makes it harder for Keir Starmer to say it's a completely new party if you have lots of members coming out and MPs saying that they back Jeremy Corbyn. Thank
you, Robert Peston, Katie Bowles. Thanks for joining us for our first segment of Spectator TV this week. Let's move on to our next Brexit. Deadlines have come and gone. An agreement has yet to be reached, but they haven't really got much time now. It all has to be done and dusted one way or another by the end of the year, and that's fast approaching. We get smoke signals coming out almost every week. Sometimes it looks like a deal is going to be done. Then others look like maybe we're not so sure. So where are we now? I'm joined by James Forsyth, our political editor, and Wolfgang Munchau, editor of Eurointelligence. Welcome to you, Wolfgang, too. James, first, give us an update on where we are at the talks as you see it.
So today's news is that Michel Barnier was meant to brief EU member states on what's been going on. He's decided not to do that. That is seen as a positive sign that they want to keep a lid on what is being discussed in these negotiations because they think they are making some progress and they think that letting in too much sunlight in on it might not work. I think the negotiations are undoubtedly more intensive this week. Simon Coveney, the Irish Foreign Minister, described it as kind of move week for both sides. And I think both sides are moving, but I think they are moving in a crab-like fashion rather than like gazelles. So I think it's too early to say that, it's all going to be done. But I think things are definitely looking more positive than they were a week or so ago. And I think there's also this, which is, I think both sides, as you get closer to this deadline, are beginning to consider the enormity of what a no deal would mean. A no deal wouldn't just be an economic event. Indeed, I actually think, given that this deal is going to be a relatively thin deal, I think the consequence of no deal will be far more geopolitical than economic. In that, I struggle to see how it does not poison UK-EU relations for a decade. And I think that would obviously bleed over into cooperation on foreign policy challenges such as Russia, or the Western response to China and the like. So I think the geopolitical forces are pushing both sides to do a deal. But on issues of substance, it is still hard. And I think the ultimate question comes down to it is if you get more movement on the level playing field, I struggle to think that the whole deal will fail over fish, that there won't be some way found to kind of massage the fishing question, which is obviously politically emotive on both sides of a channel. But I think there is a kind of sense that, if fish is the last issue, the two sides really ought to be able to fix that.
Wolfgang, let me pick up on a point James just made there. When the British started these negotiations in the latest round, there was all this talk of, we're up for Canada plus, plus, plus. We want everything in the Canadian free trade deal and a lot more on services and all the rest of it. It doesn't look to me, Wolfgang, that even if we get a deal, we'll be anywhere near that. That this is much more likely to be Canada dry than Canada plus, plus, plus.
Oh, it's Canada dry, very dry indeed. It's a very thin deal. I think we're talking about the deal versus no deal. And I agree with James. Failure to do a deal is indeed a crisis in EU-UK relations, especially if it was an acrimonious failure, as opposed to the failure where both sides say, let's just stop for now and try again next year and try to do as little damage in the meantime. There are some mitigating measures both sides could take, but the deal will be thin, and I think the big shock for many people will be when Brexit happens and there is a deal, how little this deal will comprise. Now there won't be tariffs, there won't be quotas. That shows some achievement, but tariffs are 3% on average. Okay, the average may not be meaningful because the tariffs on fish, on certain categories of fish, are going to be very high. The tariffs on cars are going to be high. There will be very visible tariffs, but on average, it's 3%. That's less than a bad day's exchange rate movements. So this is not going to be the big economic issue, but people will realize, no, there isn't a deal for financial services. There isn't a deal for any other services. There may not be a deal even for university degrees and the recognition of professional qualifications. We haven't seen the text. Nobody really knows what is being agreed. Nobody has been able to study the text. I know, the people in the European Parliament get very nervous, not because time is running out, but because they feel that they have to ratify a text that is possibly 1,800 pages long in a week, and they may just see things or discover things as ratification is a meaningful procedure. It's not just a vote. They will vote in favor of it, but a long text will have implication for companies. Nobody knows what's in it. So even if this is agreed, and it could be a very, very messy procedure.
Why has it come to this? There was talk, this could be the greatest free trade deal in history. The UK economy, the EU economy, in regulatory terms at the moment, they're totally aligned. There's the smoothest free trade between them of any parts of the world. So therefore, it shouldn't be that difficult, even though we are leaving, to move to a very ambitious free trade deal. Why has that not happened? And probably, I know people don't like to ask questions like this these days, but who's to blame?
Both sides are to blame. The EU misjudged the Brexit process from the start to the finish, and it is still misjudging it. It has played too much there was too much hope that the UK would extend the deadline in July, which it could have done. They didn't believe Johnson when he said he would not extend. They did not expect to be in the position that they are now, that Johnson hasn't folded yet. This is something they expected, because the assumption in Brussels has been the UK needs this deal more urgently than the EU. For that reason, the UK has an interest in conceding some of the points. The EU has made some unreasonable demands in the beginning, like asking or like demanding that the ECJ continues to play a role, like asking the UK to align its regulatory policies on labor markets, environmental standards, and on state aid to the EU. These negotiations have brought a lot of progress on these issues. So the differences that we have now in these negotiations, they are still important differences, but they are not the differences between good or bad. So even if one side were to give in more than the other in the phase that we have achieved at this point, it wouldn't be a disaster. It might just be a bad PR for one side. But it wouldn't be, it is a fairly balanced deal that we have at the moment. There are reasonable trade-offs to make, like on fish. I mean, the UK wants to sell fish on the European markets. The UK sells a lot of fish to Spain. The UK is a country that eats cod and exports mackerel, and Spain is a country that eats mackerel and exports cod. So one would assume that the two come to some kind of sensible agreement given the situation. And on competition policy, I have sympathies with the EU's point that if you have a large trade agreement or a trade agreement with a large trading partner next door, that you want to have a broad consensus about state aid. And in fact, the UK is not the problem here. Germany gives far more state aid to companies. So this is a bit of a straw man debate. I mean, the EU has a massive trade surplus with the EU, and we're talking about a level playing field issue in the other direction. It doesn't really make sense. And the UK should be raising level playing field issues, given that it has a deficit. So in the end, we're dealing with straw man issues that should rationally be resolved. The danger now is not the trade. The trade negotiators are doing a good job. They will identify a landing zone, I'm pretty sure, at some point next week. The difficulty they have is to ensure that when they come up with this this landing zone, that the two principals, Boris Johnson in the UK and for all we know, probably Emmanuel Macron on the EU side, will both in the end do the right thing and not start to extend this and find another way of or making another unreasonable demand that the other side would then expect. So an accident, that's possible.
Will it require that if there is to be a deal at the 11th hour, and it's quite often the 11th hour these things happen, but will it require a political intervention at a nation state level? And by that I mean, will it require Angela Merkel to have a quiet word with Emmanuel Macron, Chancellor Merkel, perhaps with the backing of the Swedes and the Dutch, and maybe even the Spanish and the Italians as well, and just try and find a way to help him down from the fish issue, perhaps find ways even of compensating him in other ways. In other words, it will take the top nation state leaders in the end to make some kind of political intervention.
If this thing is not wrapped up by, say, early next week, then that will undoubtedly happen. Merkel will talk. Merkel never put the interest of the German, used the German car industry in these negotiations. No. She really stayed out of, she prioritized the unity of the EU, which was an intelligent negotiating position. But Macron hasn't done the same. Macron has actually invoked the interest of the French fishing industry. Now, the German car industry is a multitude bigger than the French fishing industry. So, Merkel would have a point to say to Macron, I didn't do this, but you're doing this. So let's basically be reasonable and cut a deal here. I don't think that Germany can compensate France for the loss of fishing. So that would have to be negotiated with the UK. And there are ways to negotiate in terms of transitional periods, in terms of quota arrangements. The UK has enough water. There is no shortage of water. There's no shortage of fish. This is a very strange dispute to have. This is not like, we're not really dealing with serious economic issues here, but it's mostly perceptional issues. So there should be a deal, but I completely agree. This will not be decided by the negotiators. The negotiators are preparing the ground, what they're calling landing zones. That's all they can do. Neither Lord Frost nor Michel Barnier are in a position to force the hand of Macron. They do, however, obviously talk to both sides. And if Macron is not at this point not briefing his people, then that's probably to do with the fact that he hasn't yet got the clearance for a compromise. Yes. They need to talk. They need to get some more details. The French are recognizing that they need to compromise on fish. In principle, they do. But the question is to which extent they do and whether that is still compatible with the UK position. So the fish is a serious issue that could still jeopardize the thing. It's not a substantive issue in the sense that we're talking about 1 billion or 2 billion pounds of trade, which is minute compared to the other stuff. The fact that we haven't got anything on financial services is much more serious.
Let me go back to James, Wolfgang, for a minute, and then I'll finish up with you. James, putting the bravado or the public face aside, is there not some real concern in Westminster or in Whitehall that there isn't a deal? Not because the deal is going to be that great, or actually even if the deal has a deleterious effect on the economy, it'll probably in the short term all be hidden by the fallout from COVID. We're not really going to be able to measure. All the economic models we were preparing to measure what was going to happen have really been shot to hell because of COVID now. We won't really know what was COVID, what was a no-deal Brexit. But there's a kind of symbolic reputational issue for the government, is there not? Which are along the lines of, you've been useless at handling COVID and you can't even get a deal on leaving the EU.
Yeah, I think there are three big dangers. The first is the geopolitical one. The second thing is not getting a deal would make the Northern Ireland situation much more difficult. And if the UK government pressed ahead with the clauses in the internal market bill, that would strain relations with the incoming Biden administration. But I think the biggest issue is your last point on competence, Andrew, because I think in the event of a deal, you would see both sides move to keep trade flowing. I think you would see the EU take a relatively light touch approach to checks. Let's keep things moving. I think in the event of no deal, because I think no deal would inevitably be, to Wolfgang's point, would inevitably be acrimonious. I can't imagine the two negotiators shaking hands and saying, well, not shaking hands, whatever you're meant to do in this day and age, and saying, well, let's sit back down around the table in 6 months. I think it would be a political row and a blame game. I think in that situation, the EU would take a much more fingernail checking approach to border checks. It's well known that there are people around Emmanuel Macron who take the view that 6 months of that and the Brits will be back at the table and much more inclined to compromise on fish. And I think the danger for the government is people will say, well, we voted to leave in 2016. Why wasn't the country ready for this? And the other danger is, we voted for you to get Brexit done, and now Brexit's all over the news every night again. What's going on?
Wolfgang, let me finish with you, and then we're going to move across the Atlantic. Maybe I suggested in my previous question that maybe Angela Merkel would have to intervene at a political level with the support of others. Maybe what would break the logjam or get us through this, given the geopolitical consequences that James is talking about, would be an Anglo-French summit of Mr. Johnson and President Macron. Mr. Johnson speaks fluent French. They both like to drink wine together. The French like a British politician that can speak another language, partly because it doesn't happen very often. And there are huge Anglo-French relationships at stake here. Our intelligence cooperation has never been greater. And France is in the middle of a huge fight against Islamism, a fight that Mr. Macron is taking the lead. The only two militaries that really matter in Europe are France and Britain. And Britain's just announced a massive extension of the money we spend. We have 2 world-class aircraft carriers, one of which is already being deployed, the other shortly. They could work with France too. There are so many issues, the deployment of force. Britain's already helping the French out in Mali with heavy lift capabilities. If there has to be a European intervention somewhere or another, it'll only be the British and the French that can really do it. Couldn't all these issues, if they were out in the open in the future, I know now MI6 is now embedded with DGSE in Paris. DGSE is now regularly with MI6 in London. Shouldn't that matter a lot more than fish?
It would be funny if that all that were sacrificed at the over a dispute of fish. It's one of the strangest debates I think I have followed. But I completely agree. These strategic impacts that these strategic relationships that you've mentioned. The UK is a member of the UN Security Council is another important issue to consider from a European perspective. These are points that have unfortunately not played a role in the European debate. I would, however, think that Macron understands this. This is probably one thing that Macron understands better than the other European leaders who are more focused on the internal market and domestic policy issues. Macron, too, is focused on domestic policy issues. My reading of his position on fish is that he is merely putting up a fight, which he needs to do. In France, it's important that the president stands up for the small guy, and he needs to do that. If he didn't do that, others would do this, and he has an election campaign coming up in 22. So my reading of the situation is that he will put up a fight, but in the end agree. It would indeed be a failure of French policy if he didn't, and indeed it would be a disaster for French fishermen if there wasn't a deal either. So this isn't
because then
exactly,
they get no access.
It wouldn't make sense, the position. So there is a possibility, as you say, a Franco-UK summit is a possibility. I think they might just settle this on the phone, frankly. The issues are very clear that in the end, they have to both be seen to be fighting and settle this. There is an accident possibility, as there always are in these negotiations, especially since the EU has other crises at the moment about the EU budget, Viktor Orban of Hungary. These are issues that are kind of distracting them at the moment. It could be that they are, taking the eye off the ball. That is quite possible. But under any normal circumstances, there should be a deal happening before the end of the year. It might not even happen next week. The EU has several mechanisms, or it's at least considering mechanisms to delay the whole ratification process. For example, this thing could go until Christmas and then they ratify later. That is a possibility. It's not yet fully explored legally. It's uncharted territory, but it's not clear that it's impossible. So, and they will do anything to get it to they will not let this fail over, time is running out. That's not going to be the issue.
Right. Wolfgang, come back and mark our card as we reach the end game of this process. It's been a joy to have you on Spectator TV today. Wolfgang Munchau there. Let's turn to the continued fallout for our final segment from the US election. Mr. Trump still refusing to concede, filed lawsuits in a number of battleground states. Not clear they're getting anywhere. Joe Biden's announced some of his White House team. He's attacked the president for refusing him access to the classified briefings that are normally afforded a president-elect during the 11-week interregnum between election and inauguration. Let's go first to Freddie Gray, our US editor, and just get an update from him. Freddie, where are we on the various challenges to the results in some of the battleground states?
Well, Team Trump keeps promising a big reveal. One of his lawyers, Sidney Powell, said they were about to unleash the Kraken. But so far, we haven't seen the Kraken yet. We've just seen Rudy Giuliani give this very strange appearance in court. And I think Rudy Giuliani is a lot brighter than a lot of people give him credit for. And I think he's been a very effective operator throughout his career. But they're setting themselves up for mockery at the moment because they keep making a lot of claims that this great reveal is going to come. And we're going to see how it's either Dominion, the computer software, rigged the election for Biden, or that there are masses of dead people voting, or that the mail-in balloting system was massively fraudulent on an epic scale. But they just don't seem to be producing clear enough evidence to convince people. And the problem for them is not necessarily that they're wrong, it's that the large majority of Americans just want this election to be done and they want to move on. I don't think at the moment, I haven't seen any sufficient evidence to suggest they're going to be able to prove that the election was fraudulent. I do think there almost certainly was fraudulence because mail-in balloting is a terrible business. And particularly in this recent American election, we've seen it's a mess because you have different states having different systems and nobody has been quite sure what's going on for the last 2 weeks. So I think you have an urgent case for electoral reform, but I don't see how the Republicans can prove that they've been robbed.
Well, stick with us, Freddie. Let me bring in now Candace Owens, who we welcome to Spectator TV. She's a conservative commentator, author of Blackout, founder of Blexit. It's an organization urging Black Americans to stop voting Democrat, which they do in huge numbers. You might know from her days as the communications director of Turning Point. Candace Owens, welcome to Spectator TV. Is it not time now for Mr. Trump to concede and move on?
No, and I strongly disagree. with Freddie's assessment that the American people want this election to be over with. It's quite the opposite. You had 73 million people voting for Donald J. Trump, and all of these people right now are being gaslit by the media. There was once upon a time where the media would tell the people's story, right? So right now we've just had the media telling their own version of events, not speaking to any Americans who are presenting tons of evidence. They send it to me of their own ballots not being cast, not being counted. People showing you that their dead relatives have voted in this election. This was one of the most insane elections that we've ever had. Mind you, the media, the very same media who prepped us all year saying that this election, we're not going to figure out the results. It's going to be unlike any election we've ever had because of COVID-19 and mail-in ballots. It's going to take weeks and weeks and weeks for us to be able to count. Now, that same exact media is saying, well, never mind, Trump just needs to concede. And we had an election where we all went to bed at 2 a.m. Trump was winning by a lot. And then suddenly we woke up and we were told that the exact opposite had happened. They stopped counting and suddenly there was a massive dump of ballots and Joe Biden was in the lead. Everything about this feels fraudulent. And to say you should just certify the election because the media is ready to move on, which is what we're really getting at. The media is ready to move on. The media has been ready to move on from Trump, honestly, since he won in 2016.
Right.
It's wrong.
But you call the election fraudulent and talk about the media. But even Donald Trump's own lawyers in key states are not alleging fraud. In Arizona, in Pennsylvania, his own lawyers have said, we're not alleging fraud. So it's not just the media. The fact is, you haven't got the evidence to show fraud on any kind of great scale.
Which of Trump's lawyers, because you're making
Okay,
that statement.
all right, I'll give you two. His lawyer in Arizona, when asked by the judge, said, we're not alleging fraud or the stealing of the election. We're talking about, quote, good faith or errors. That's Donald Trump's lawyer. Or in the case in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, the judge asked the lawyer, are you alleging fraud here? No, we are not alleging fraud.
Okay, so the error. Okay, if we're talking about the word fraud and you're reducing it down to the word fraud, what we have realized is that these errors that seem to be happening, these accidental errors where they transfer votes from Trump to Joe Biden only seem to be happening one way. So whether you want to say it was human error, which is what the Dominion Voting Systems is arguing at this point in America, that it was all human error and something happened and someone pressed the wrong button, fine. But the results are fraudulent to the American people. You cannot just move on when 73 million people do not trust the election process and do not trust the votes. And it was done in a year where you transformed the election process. You guys don't do this in the UK. You guys don't calculate and do an electronic system. They don't do this in Canada. They forced this. No. They forced this in America because of COVID-19. And if you go back and look at my rhetoric,
but you're the one that used the word fraudulent.
Yes,
I gave you two examples. I mean, fraudulent and fraud mean the same thing. I gave you two examples of his own lawyers not alleging fraud in two key states.
Yes.
Where did the Dominion voting machine, what evidence is presented that that's made a difference?
Well, I'm not Sidney Powell, so you're speaking to me as if I'm not the person who presented Dominion voting systems as an issue or an error.
You just raised it, Candace. You raised it.
In Michigan, I'm saying that the votes were changed. 6,000 people who voted for Donald J. Trump got changed to Joe Biden. So that happened in America, and they've come out and they said that was a human who pressed the wrong button.
Are you talking about Antrim County in Michigan?
I'm not sure. It could be Antrim County, yes, correct?
But what happened was that the original report in Antrim County was wrong. These votes hadn't been moved. It was the report of the voting that was wrong, not the voting machine that was right. And it was right.
No, that was Dominion Voting Systems. That was their argument. But the other people are saying that it was the Dominion Voting System is saying it was a human error, and Sidney Powell and Trump's campaign is saying it was not a human error, that the system was designed to be able to do this. And this is what he's talking about when Sidney Powell is saying that they have more evidence that they're willing to present. And rather than allow them and afford them the right to do this, the entire mainstream media is saying, just move on. It's not here. Why not just allow them? This is what our system allows for. Allow the due process to go through. Why are we trying to sweep this under the rug and move on and say, well, we don't have any evidence yet, so it needs to be closed? Again, this is the same media that told us this election was going to take months and months and months to count, including Joe Biden himself. Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton boldly said that Joe Biden, if he lost, should not concede. So I don't understand how the media can then just flip and say, you know what, the exact opposite, and gaslight all of the American people who they've been conditioning to believe that this election was going to take months to transform. To call.
Okay, I want to move on, but it's not a question. I would just say before we do of sweeping things under the carpet. It's a question of looking very carefully at all the evidence people who take your side present, and then discovering that in most cases it doesn't stand up to scrutiny. That doesn't mean sweeping it under the carpet. But indulge me, let's assume that I'm right, that at some stage Mr. Trump does have to concede Joe Biden is the next president, the 46th president of the United States. Will Donald Trump run again, do you think?
I don't know. That's a good question. I would hope he would run again. I mean, I don't think that any person, this is going to be a bad election result no matter what, because as you're seeing in recent polling, there are 73 million people who do not believe that this election was executed in good faith. And we have been saying this since long before the election. I've been saying this since March. The idea of transforming the entire election system in 1 year and expecting states to be able to do with this, and having so many people's voices censored, right? People that are speaking out about their own election fraud stories are right now being censored by the big tech. I just don't think it's going to be a very testy time in America, and it already has been for the last 4 years. So perhaps he will run. If he did, obviously, I would support him. I think he should. But it's wrong. And I'll tell you what is fraudulent is all of the mainstream media and the tech people calling President Biden, calling former Vice President Biden the president-elect. That is incorrect. Right. It is wrong language. He should be called a presidential candidate. This election has not been called by the states.
Okay, let's try and keep on track here because I haven't got too much time. Mark our card and on this now. Let's again assume Mr. Trump doesn't run. I mean, I perfectly understand he may well, but let's assume he doesn't. Tell us, what will the battle for the soul of the GOP be like?
It's going to have to stick with what's been dubbed as Trumpism. The GOP has completely changed. It's no longer the establishment Republican Party. And when I say that, I'm talking about the John McCain Republican Party. It's completely transformed over the last 4 years for the better. It's become more inclusive, which you can see by looking at the early exit polling numbers. Hispanics largely, and I think 36% voted for Donald J. Trump this election. Black women doubled their support for Donald Trump. Black men voted 18% for Trump. So despite all of the rhetoric of trying to smear and libel him as a racist, the party has actually become incredibly more inclusive. And that's in large part because Donald J. Trump was a more cultural figure. What I mean by that is that he was able to communicate his message in a more effective way, and he felt more attainable to the American people. And I get that he's a boisterous, busty billionaire from New York, but he does, when he speaks to people, he's very much a blue collar and able to relate to them in a different way. And I think that's
just be clear what it is you're saying, because it's interesting what you say. You're saying that even without Mr. Trump, and maybe actually be with Mr. Trump, we don't know, but even without Mr. Trump, the Republican Party will still, to at least a substantial degree, have become and remain a Trumpian party.
Absolutely, without question.
And if that's the case, Candace, who, in the absence of Mr. Trump, perhaps he's gone off to start his own new TV station or whatever it is he wants to do. In the absence of Mr. Trump, what kind of Republicans today do you think best embody these Trumpian values?
There are a lot of different elements of Trump. So if you're talking about just being a person who, doesn't balk when the mainstream media is on their backs, somebody like Ron DeSantis, right? I mean, he has stood firm in the COVID-19. Kristi Noem in South Dakota has stood firm on her policies despite the media creating a pressure campaign against her on COVID-19. What we're really talking about is someone who does not bend to the will of the mainstream media, because the mainstream media does not represent Americans at this moment. And I would even go so far as to say the mainstream media doesn't represent people in the UK as well, right? They completely missed it.
That may be the case, but though I'm interested, you've managed to work the mainstream media into every answer.
I get that you're a part of the mainstream media and it can be offensive, but you have to call it accurately. You right. Understand they just keep misdiagnosing the people that they are supposed to be representing, and rather than
let's see if I can get an answer without the mainstream media being involved. It seems to me, I mean, I know what you want. It's clear what you want, and you're certainly not alone in that even without Mr. Trump, you think that Mr. Trump has transformed the Republican Party. It's a very different party, not just from the old East Coast country club Republican Party, but also even from the Goldwater Reagan West Coast Republican Party as well. And you think he's made a big change there. I understand that, but you will know there are still plenty of people in the Republican Party that see this as their chance, if Mr. Trump departs, to go back to not a country club Republican Party, but maybe a more Reaganite kind of a Republican Party. So there is going to be a battle for the soul of the Republican Party, is there not?
I don't believe so. I think the Republican Party has actually never been more united. And there was definitely a fracturing when he first hit the stage in 2015. And there were many people, the Never Trump parade, and Republicans who did not stand behind him, but all of those Republicans stood behind him this election cycle. So, despite, I won't say mainstream media, but despite depictions, the Republican Party is actually very much together in this moment, and I don't think anybody wants to go backwards.
Let me bring Freddie in, then I'll come back and finish with you, Candace. Freddie, what do you make of what you've heard?
Well, I hate to be accused of siding with the mainstream media. I've always tried not to.
God, you're at it as well now.
It's just, I've been busted. My closet never Trumpism has been exposed. But I do think it's very interesting about what happens to the Republican Party after Trump. And I do think we have to have this conversation despite the ongoing contestation. I'm just interested in how much you can withdraw Trump from the scene and still have the movement he created. And I think one of his failings as a leader, and I hope Candace doesn't object too much to this, is that he hasn't established a movement that can work politically. He hasn't taken over Washington in the way that he could have done. He hasn't even taken over the Republican Party in the way that he could have done. And so when he goes, if he goes, you will see this revert to the mean. And I think it will fail. I think the Bush-era Republican Party is destined to fail. But Trump hasn't established a party that can go forward without him. And I wonder whether it can, because one of the reasons Trump is loved, and I agree with Candace, he is really loved, is because of his flaws. It's because of his failings. So a lot of people, when they talk about Trumpism without Trump, they imagine a sort of a Trump-like person, a national populist, who sort of doesn't have his flaws, doesn't send out nasty tweets. But the tweets and the Trump, the element of the Donald, is crucial to Trumpism. I wonder how it can survive. And I would like to put it to Candace that I think the likely way in which it survives is with Donald Trump Jr. running in 2024, perhaps with Candace Owens as his Veep.
Candace?
I agree very much with your assessment, and I would only say that if you look at America just through the lens of the past, people usually need a break from the family. So I don't know that Don Trump Jr. following Donald J. Trump works. But then again, if people feel like they were not vindicated in the 2020 election cycle, maybe it does. But you are correct that it's going to have to be somebody who is a fighter. And at the end of the day, those are the characteristics of Donald J. Trump. He's a fighter. Excuse me, my cat has apparently jumped into this. It is, I would totally. People have always asked me, am I going to run? Am I going to jump in and throw my hat in the ring? And I always say the same thing Trump said 20 years ago. If I felt that my country needed me and that I had to do it, I would. I have no desires to do it. I don't think it's a fun job. I think it's a sacrifice, and that too many people want to go in for vain reasons when in fact it's an incredibly difficult job to lead a country. That's
a brilliantly political answer.
Yeah. Sounds to me you're definitely running, Candace. You got that answer down to a pad. But listen, we watched this election, the so-called young country. It seemed to be you had to be 75 plus before you were allowed to be a candidate or a candidate succeeded. Donald Trump, Joe Biden, indeed, who were the likely alternatives? Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders. All these people, their combined ages come to about 2.5 million years. Isn't it time for a break? And your party, your Republican party, and I appreciate you're an insurgent in the Republican Party, but it's too male, pale, and stale as well. You need to reach out and get a lot more voters. You did badly among a lot of the women's vote. You need more ethnic votes. You need to be younger. I think of all that, and who am I? And you need a true believer. If you take the view that the Trumpian way is still the future, you need a true believer. So I think of all that, and I look at you on my Zoom screen here, and I think, who ticks every box? Candace Owens. Just announce you're running today on Spectator TV.
I love that. I love the encouragement. I'm a different kind of person. I've never been one of those people that has a plan. Everyone says to me, what are you going to do in 5 years, 10 years? I'm a big believer that you have plans and God laughs. And,
Not in 4 years.
Well played. Obviously there's a big energy for that, and people really want to see that. But I'm being honest when I say that every time I sit down with my husband and talk about that, I just say, if it comes to that, and I felt that my country needed me, I would do it. But I genuinely do believe that as a sacrifice. I love my life as it is. I get to say what I believe unapologetically, and I live a great life. I'm happily married with a kid on the way. So the idea of sitting down and plotting and planning to become the president of the United States, to me, there's just something about that's incredibly narcissistic, and I don't have that character trait. But if I do announce, I will definitively do it on Spectator TV.
We're going to hold you to that. I mean, everything you say, the more I'm convinced. I mean, even the baby's going to arrive in plenty of time.
Perfect little half black, half white baby, half English, half American. It's going to be great.
Long before you need to start the primary campaign trail. That would be perfect. And you're married to a Brit. And it's about time there was a Brit back in the White House as well. That can only make for an improvement. If you don't do that, we might burn it down again, as we did in 1812. So it's all going well. Listen, whether you run or not, I hope you really come back and see us on Spectator TV. We wish you all the best for the coming Christmas season, and good luck with the baby in the months ahead.
Thank you so much.
Candace Owens, thank you for joining us. Indeed, thanks to all of our guests for joining us on this edition of Spectator TV. A very special thanks to our sponsor, Charles Stanley. Charles Stanley is one of the UK's leading wealth management firms, one of the oldest firms on the London Stock Exchange. Now, YouTube viewers, you can subscribe to our channel, whatever device you're on. Just tap the red subscribe button below the video and then the bell icon that appears afterwards. This way you'll be notified whenever we post a new video. You'll never miss an episode of Spectator TV. As always, please send us your thoughts. We know there's room for improvement to SpectatorTV at spectator.co.uk. That's SpectatorTV at spectator.co.uk. We hope you'll join us again next Thursday for another The Week in 60 Minutes. Bye-bye.